All right, so in today's lesson, 11-3, we're going to be actually proving and applying the congruence criteria. So that's all those SSS, SAS, ASA, and AAS, those criteria that we learned that actually work for proving a triangle. So we're actually going to be doing proofs today. I know they're your favorite. So instead of using the book, I made a note sheet for us just so we could practice more examples together. So make sure you have that handy. It's posted with the Google Classroom with the link for the video. So print that out for yourself or use it to follow along with, but here we go. Okay, so we're going to prove congruence, okay, using our definitions and things we've learned from the past. And then we're also going to actually use it to answer some questions at the end. So at the beginning here, I made you guys kind of a little cheat sheet, okay, when we're talking about how to do the proofs for these triangle problems. So the first thing you always want to do, and I'm going to just get my little eraser here and go back to the full page so we can see this all. Okay, but the first thing you want to do is you want to mark your picture, okay? If you see anything that says congruent or anything like that, you want to make sure you mark it on your picture so it makes it kind of a visual that you know what goes with what. So you mark it with all the given and assumed information, okay? But remember, you do not mark the prove statement because you're going to need that. You're actually going to have to prove that, so you don't know that yet. So mark what's given and what's assumed in your picture right away. Start by doing that. Okay. The given information, remember, is always the first thing we start with. Okay. So we write down what's given, and our reason in that statement is given. Okay. They told us that. Okay. And then the two main assumed facts you're going to see, and I talked about this in the last video a little bit, is if it shares a side. So if there's a side that's shared between the triangles, remember, we can mark those as congruent because of the reflexive property. Okay. So if they're sharing the same side, like A, if this side is A and this side is B, AB would be congruent to AB. They're the same exact sides, so they're congruent to each other. That's reflexive property. So that's an assumed information that you can mark. The other one is if we see kind of like, they call this like a bow tie problem. Okay, and that's if we have that's going to give us vertical angles. So mark those two because according to our vertical angles theorem, we know if we have vertical angles that they are congruent. Okay. So whatever is given and those assumed properties, mark those if you have them in your picture, and then you can kind of start to look for how can you prove triangle congruence. Okay, so when you're going to prove that two triangles are congruent, remember we have these four options to do it with. We have SSS, side, 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 angle, or angle, angle, side. Remember the angle is not one, and neither is SSA, that bad word one. Okay. If you have to prove something after you've already proven that the triangles are congruent, so sometimes they'll ask you like prove a side is congruent to another side, or prove one of the angles is congruent to an angle, then we're going to use this kind of reasoning here. Now it's abbreviated as CPCTC, which stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So instead of saying this every time, if you have to prove a statement and writing out corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, we abbreviate it using this kind of acronym here. So it's CPCTC. So you can just write that and I'll know that you know what it means, that once we prove triangles are congruent, then we can know that all their corresponding parts have to be congruent as well. Okay. Last thing, to make sure you actually proved it, okay, remember we need a minimum of 3 things congruent. So make sure your proof has 3 things. And make sure your proof statement is the last statement that you write there. Okay, so we'll always start with the given, we'll always end with the proof. So this is a good little cheat sheet to kind of help you out and remember kind of how to make those proofs, because I know we hated those when we did them before. So let's do a couple proofs together. The more we practice, the better we're going to get at it. But in example A, this is from your book here, so I just stole from the book. We have Greg knows that point X is the midpoint of JK. He also makes a statement that JL is congruent to KL. He must prove to his boss, that that triangle JXL is congruent to triangle KXL. So here's our given statements. So again, we're going to use those and mark up our picture as much as we can. So they told us JL is congruent to KL. So let's mark those with a little tick mark. We also know that X is the midpoint. So remember, if X is the midpoint, that means JX has to be congruent then to XK. We also have that. And then we have an assumed thing here. Remember, we have two triangles sharing this side. So there's our reflexive property coming in. That's an assumed congruence there. So LX is congruent to itself, LX. So now we're going to write our proof. So let's start by writing our statements, our given statements. So we have that JL is congruent to KL. And we know that X is the midpoint of JK. And again, our reason there is because that is what is given. Okay, so now we're going to use that to kind of help us go, again, remember we need to prove three things are congruent in order to show congruent triangles. So remember when I marked JX and XK, I marked those as congruent. So we have to say why we did that. Is congruent to, let's say, XK. And the reason those were congruent is because they told us that X was the midpoint. So that's our definition of a midpoint. Okay. Lastly was that reflexive property I used. I said that LK has to be congruent to itself. And that was because of the reflexive property. Okay. So now I've proved three things congruent. I proved that from the given, we had one side. I proved two sides were congruent because of a midpoint, and I have another side congruent because of reflexive property. So since I have three parts, I can now do my proof statement. Triangle JXL is congruent to triangle KXL. And since we have three sides, that's SSS. Okay. So there is our proof. So again, mark up your picture because then you're going to see probably right away what congruence criteria you're going to actually use. Okay. But then here's kind of a follow-up question now. Can we conclude that angle J is congruent to angle J is congruent to angle K? Well, according to our congruence statement, if these are congruent triangles, then yes, those have to be congruent. And of course, the reason for that is because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay. Let's look at another proof here. Suppose Greg knew instead that LX, so this line LX, bisects the angle JLK. So JLK. So if it bisects it, remember that means that we have equal angles there. It's going to cut the angle into two equal parts. So I'm just going to mark that. Could he prove to his boss that those triangles are congruent then? So we have this angle. Remember, we know reflexive property, so we know that LX is congruent to itself. But that's all we actually know here. So I only have a side and one angle. So we can't actually prove congruence here. That's a no. Okay, we only... Let's keep going out on me. We only have two congruent parts here. So we cannot prove congruence yet. We would either need another side. We'd have to know about JK. We'd have to know like those sides are congruent. Or we would need another angle. Okay, we'd have to know that like angle JXL is congruent to angle KXL, something like that. So we would need another congruence in order to prove it. So make sure you always have three. Okay, let's look at this proof here. So this one is not from your book. I just kind of use this one. But we have that MA is congruent to MH. So let's mark this. We have MA is congruent to MH. We are also told that TA is congruent to TH. Okay, and then we also have our assumed reflexive property here. So looking at my picture, which congruence criteria do you think we're going to actually use in our proof? Okay, well, let's start. Let's write our givens. So we had MA congruent to MH. We also had that TA was congruent to TH, and that it was given. Okay, number 2, we have, I know that MT is congruent to itself, and we know that because of the reflexive property. So now I've proved 3 things are congruent, so I can prove those triangles, right? MAT to triangle MHT. And if you were right, we were proving those by side, side, side. Okay, we proved 3 sides congruent, so SSS. Okay. Let's do one more together, and then you guys are going to try one. So in number 2, it says XL bisects angle JLK. So I'm going to mark that. If it bisects JLK, that means this angle has to be congruent to that angle. If it bisects it, it cuts it exactly in half. So we have 2 congruent angles there. We're also told that angle J is congruent to angle K. So I'm going to mark that picture. And then again, we have our reflexive property there. So we know that LX is congruent to itself. So let's go ahead and put in our statements. We have angle J congruent to angle K. And we also know that XL bisects angle JLK. So those are our given statements. Okay, number 2. So what did I use? I used that bisect statement to show that angle JLX is congruent to angle KLX. And I knew that those were congruent because that is the definition of an angle bisector. So I was able to prove those congruent. Next, I'm able to say that LX is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. Okay, so now let's see what we are given here. In my picture, I see I have an angle, and a side. So AAS, that's one of our congruence criteria. But look, they didn't ask us to prove that the triangles are congruent. They want us to prove that JL, they want us to prove that JL is congruent to KL. Well, the only way I can prove that is if I say that these are congruent triangles. So I can say that triangle JLX is congruent to triangle KLX. And remember, the order does matter on your congruent statements, so make sure you order it in the right way. And the way we can prove that is because we had an angle, and a side. So since we now have our triangles congruent, we can get to that prove statement, which is JL is actually congruent to KL because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So even though they didn't ask us to prove the triangles are congruent, they're asking us about sides of the congruent triangles. So prove congruence first of the triangles, and then use CPCTC to prove that anything else in the triangle is congruent to each other. Okay? All right, this last one I'm going to have you guys try on your own. So they're giving you that C is the midpoint of AE. Angle A and angle E are congruent. I want you to prove that angle side AB is congruent to side ED. So go ahead and set up your proof, mark your picture up, Do whatever you have to do, but get to that prove statement and make sure your proof is going in a logical order. Okay, whatever you mark on your picture, you have to make sure you have a reason and a statement for that on your proof. So take a minute here, go through this problem and see how it goes. Okay, here is the proof that I have. So our given statements, we know that angle A is congruent to angle E. Okay, you were told that C is a midpoint of AE, so that makes you have congruent sides there. AC has to be congruent to EC because that's the definition of a midpoint. You also have some congruent angles here. This is like that bow tie problem, they call it. So we have vertical angles. So ACB is congruent to ECD. Then now I have an angle, a side, and an angle. So I prove the triangles are congruent. So then I can prove that their corresponding parts are congruent. Okay. So again, it's very important to kind of draw on the picture, kind of get all of your given information and your assumed information. That picture should kind of lead you to the steps that you're going to do in your proof. So whatever you mark on your picture, you need a statement for that in your proof. So just kind of go one thing at a time, see how you can prove it. Remember, to prove triangle congruence, we need 3 things congruent, 3 corresponding parts. And it can either be side, 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 angle, side, angle side, or angle side angle. So make sure you're using one of the 4 criteria. Remember, you can never use angle, 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 and we can never use side, side angle. That's the bad word one. Okay. All right, I'll see you in the next video.